Hello everybody, can you hear me? Yes? Okay. We're going to make a start. Thank you all so much for coming today. My name's Fiona Finlayson. I'm the Manager of Open Space Planning and Green Infrastructure at the City of Melbourne. And I'm going to straight away introduce our Acting Lord Mayor, Nicholas Rees, for a formal welcome.
Thank you very much for that, Fiona, and thank you for sparing me that readout of my CV that you sometimes get at these events, which is just awful. So a great introduction. On behalf of the City of Melbourne, welcome to the Canopy Melbourne Green Roof Forum. I am Nicholas Rees. I am Melbourne's Acting Lord Mayor this week while Sally takes a break. And can I first begin by paying my respects to the traditional owners. Wamanjenka, Marambik Burundap, Wurundjeri Wilam Liwik Kulin, Yalambu Ba Yiramboy. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri traditional owners, their ancestors, and the Kulin people past and present. Can I also acknowledge the good folks who are here from the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, DELWP as we mostly refer to them, who have partnered with the City of Melbourne to help fund the research projects we're going to be hearing about today. Can I also acknowledge and thank the University of Melbourne, great to see Padmini here as well, and Victoria University for their support. And can I also welcome the real stars of today, our presenters, including Rose Macaulay, Fatma Balany, Julia Schiller, Bihan Gao, Zara Sarian, Dean Sharika, who are all the PhD candidates who are focusing on green infrastructure. And I am sure their supervisors and some of their support team are here. I know how important you all are, so I want to acknowledge you as well. And I also want to just note that the funding for some of the individual researchers came from Hort Innovation Australia, the Clean Air and Urban Landscapes Hub, Holsworth Wildlife Research Endowment, and the Ecological Society of Australia. And welcome also to everybody else who is here today, who is as passionate as I am, as passionate as so many of us are about green infrastructure. Melbourne needs a green roof revolution. Melbourne needs a green infrastructure revolution. The unused rooftops of Melbourne's buildings are a massively underutilised resource that has the potential to create new green space for Melbourne that is bigger than Royal Park. This is the scale of the opportunity that lies before us. This is what you amazing people are here today to help us achieve. Now, I don't know about you, but during lockdown, I became very close to many of the plants in my life. Over 2 years, I just kept buying indoor plants, and it's fair to say it probably got a little bit out of control. By the end of lockdown, I basically had a rainforest growing in my home. I remember one day in winter, I had the heater on, and I was so worried about the impact of the hot, dry air that I actually opened the window to let some, cool, moist air in for the plants. And those of you with a sort of scientific background probably can imagine what happened. That cold, moist air sort of ran right into the warm air from the heater. And cumulus cloud formed in my living room, and there was a thunderstorm that happened, watering all the plants. That's not actually true, I just made that up. But I was going a little bit crazy there during lockdown, and that thought did cross my mind one day. But the point is, certainly that period did remind us the importance of plants and vegetation and greenery in our lives, and the fact that indoor plants seem to be very much embraced by Melburnians during lockdown hopefully only opens our eyes even more to the potential of including greenery in all other aspects of our lives and our city as well. A quick glance around Melbourne shows you the rapid growth in city greening projects. Certainly on our part of the City of Melbourne, we have planted more than 25,000 trees since 2012. and we've delivered more than 6 hectares of new open green space. In more recent times, we've seen the wonderful rise of people finding ways to add plants and trees to their laneways, their precincts, their walls, their facades, their building entrances and their roofs, all of which increase the amount of vegetation in the city. For the City of Melbourne's perspective, this is something that we very much welcome and something which we are very much trying to encourage. The visual appeal of city greening projects, the myriad of ways, is just one of the myriad of ways that we can help cool our city and contribute to making our urban environment much more desirable. Plants and trees provide clean air, clean water, and increase our resilience to the impacts of climate change. In our city, there is still so much promise because green infrastructure can be included on new buildings or retrofitted. One area that I have been personally very interested in is indeed building rooftops. The unused rooftops of Melbourne's buildings are a massively underutilised resource. Our current estimate of City of Melbourne rooftop spaces sits at somewhere approaching an extraordinary 1,500 hectares. Our mapping shows that at least 330 hectares of rooftops have low or no constraints for retrofit with green roofs. These roofs could create a new Royal Park in the sky. Royal Park is our biggest park currently in the City of Melbourne. Now, the City of Melbourne has a range of innovative programs to encourage the private sector to increase its uptake of green roofs and green infrastructure. One fine example is our Urban Forest Fund, which provides financial support to new private projects, including green rooftops, tree planting and biodiversity projects. A great example of this is the new Melbourne Sky Farm. The fund has provided $300,000 to help transform that rooftop, which was a concrete car park overlooking the Yarra, into an urban farm. It's also been a fantastic test bed for soils, for plantings and for irrigation infrastructure. Now, while Melbourne has made a good start in greening our skyline, we are a long, long way behind the sorts of cities that we like to compare ourselves to. There are currently around 40 green roofs covering about 5 hectares in the City of Melbourne area. Now, this compares to a city like Toronto, which has about 500 green roofs, or Munich, which has 300 hectares of green roofs in that city. In 2009, Toronto was the first city in North America to adopt a bylaw to require and govern the construction of green roofs. Munich has had laws that mandate green roofs since the 1990s. Other cities like Berlin, Chicago, London, Seattle, Tokyo, San Francisco, and most recently New York, all use what I would describe as both carrot and stick incentives to encourage green roofs. They've created a greener city by introducing planning requirements that effectively mandate green roofs and green space in new developments. These cities are now using the regulatory stick to encourage more green space in private developments. And research has shown that both the carrot and the stick has helped to deliver better outcomes in these cities. Now, I head up the city's planning portfolio, so I look at Melbourne's planning laws a lot, and I do see great potential to use the planning framework to encourage more city greening in Melbourne. And I ask the question, what levers can the city use to require or mandate our planning laws to require better greening outcomes for residents and workers? The City of Melbourne's proposed Planning Scheme Amendment C376 will require that new buildings achieve a minimum mandatory green factor score. This requires that new buildings will in effect have to include green infrastructure. We hope that the Victorian Government will approve this amendment without making changes which would remove or water down that provision, and I'm sure everybody here hopes that the Victorian Government does that approval as well. We also know that one of the major barriers to the uptake of green roofs in Melbourne and Australia in general is the limited evidence of best design plants and conditions for this important infrastructure to thrive in what could only be described in Melbourne as our unique weather conditions. That's why today's forum is so important. It's a chance to showcase the best green infrastructure, research and projects. This city is full of experts and enthusiasts in this field. Myself, I'm the enthusiast included. This Canopy Forum brings together developers, designers, planners, landscape architects, horticulturalists, industry, academics and policymakers to share green infrastructure ideas and concepts. We need your help. The City of Melbourne, we cannot do this alone. We need your expertise, your scientific guidance and insight to develop better guidelines for planting, maintenance and irrigation options for green roofs in the variety of different settings that exist across our city. Today we will hear, I'm delighted to say, from Melbourne's next generation of green infrastructure researchers. Their dynamic research projects cover themes such as green roof health and wellbeing benefits, biodiversity and ecology. I want to congratulate in advance all today's presenters. I know the ardour and challenge involved in being a PhD candidate, but you are building an evidence base that will be used to transform our city as well as urban environments everywhere. When I was a kid, we used to have on our licence plates and big motor vehicles a description of Melbourne as the capital of the Garden State. I hope that one day we can be celebrated as the Garden Roof State. It's a noble task, it's a hugely important task, and so without any further ado, let's get on with it. Thank you so much for listening to me today. I'm delighted to declare this forum open. And I'll now introduce back to the stage Fiona Finlayson, who is the City of Melbourne's Manager of Open Space Planning and Green Infrastructure, to take things from here. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you, Acting Lord Mayor, for that wonderful welcome and introduction. Now, in the spirit of today, where we are following the 5-minute thesis format, I will not keep speaking and I'll hand straight to our first speaker, Rose Macaulay. So, Rose, if you would like to come up to the stage. Now, Rose will talk us through her thesis on experiencing green roofs, the impact of mindful engagement on restoration and connection with nature. Thank you, Rose.
Hi everyone, and thanks for that introduction, Fiona. My name's Rose and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne and in the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences. My PhD supervisors who are here today are Professor Catherine Williams, Associate Professor Catherine Johnson and Dr. Kate Lee. Today you're going to hear about a range of different projects on urban green roofs, from plant traits and survival to biodiversity and microclimates. I'm going to kick off these presentations by thinking about the individual human experience of urban nature and what those experiences are made up of. Today, I'm going to tell you about my PhD research, where I've explored the ways in which people engage with or pay attention to the experience of nature in an urban environment. There's a lot of research now that tells us that spending time in nature is good for us. Whether that's in a forested environment or an urban green space, these experiences can lead to wellbeing benefits like restoration of attention and mood and a sense of connection with nature. And typically, researchers acknowledge that the benefits of spending time in nature tend to depend on the characteristics of that experience. So environmental characteristics, like whether it's well vegetated or if there's a shady spot to sit, but also personal attributes and social context, such as whether an individual's in company or their level of mood or prior level of connection with nature. In my research, there's a third broad category of influence in the experience of nature. and that is what an individual pays attention to and how they're thinking and feeling towards nature when they're in it. I call this cognitive engagement with nature. In my PhD, I set out to understand how individuals engage with nature and what that means for wellbeing benefits of those experiences. If we're wanting to create experiences for people to interact with, feel restored by, feel connected with nature, it's really important that we understand all these components of the experiences that will do that and how they relate to one another. So to understand these things, I used two study designs in my PhD. Both studies were going to be conducted in a range of urban green spaces, including urban green roofs in Melbourne. However, with the pandemic, a lot of my research data collection had to be conducted remotely and online. So the urban green spaces people visited were typically urban green spaces around their homes. But the findings from this work certainly still apply to green roof research and practice, and I'll talk through some of those outcomes today. So first, I conducted interviews with people after they spent a short work break in an urban green space. I'm going to focus more on my second study today, where I conducted a field experiment where participants were randomly allocated to 4 different groups who received instructions on their smartphones about how to engage during a 20-minute outdoor experience. One group was instructed to engage mindfully with their experience in that 20 minutes. Another group were instructed to direct attention to their experience in ways that didn't involve qualities that are specific to mindfulness. Another group received prompts to just let their minds wander in nature in that 20 minutes, and a control group were unguided, so they didn't receive any instructions at all. So I tested whether those engagement instructions affected these outcomes of attention restoration, nature connection, and mood differently across these groups. I wanted to find out which nature-based interventions were effective in heightening engagement with nature and subsequently improving wellbeing outcomes. So I'm just going to talk through some results and broad outcomes of my research to give you a bit of an overview. First, what I found was that these different forms of engagement in nature, delivered with these different instructions, were associated with different wellbeing outcomes afterwards. So here we can see that for negative affect or negative mood after the nature experience, the group who were instructed just to let their minds wander actually had the lowest negative mood afterwards. So they felt better after the nature experience. Another outcome was that the group that received no instructions, who were unguided, had the best attention performance afterwards. So this might tell us that these engagement instructions that other groups received, and we're seeing a little bit in the literature, might actually be somewhat effortful and lead to lower attention performance compared to a control group. I secondly tested whether these other contextual factors like environmental and personal attributes influenced how individuals engaged during the experience. Here in this bottom graph, you can see that how restorative a person perceived the environment to be had a really strong impact on how individuals engaged with that experience, which was subsequently associated with better mood and nature connection afterwards. So in the context of green roofs, this might tell us that urban green roof design that focuses on restoration qualities, like being really fascinating and allowing individuals to have a sense of being away from their everyday stresses, is going to impact how individuals pay attention to and how they're cognitively thinking and feeling towards nature during that time, which, as I've demonstrated, has these implications for wellbeing outcomes. The interpretation of these results has led to some broader practical outcomes from my research for green roofs. So first, urban nature experiences can be designed to encourage ways of engaging in nature, and that could be through environmental design that promotes certain ways of engagement, or through individual training or instruction to engage more deeply with nature. Interventions should consider the individual and group capacities at the time, the psychological outcomes that are being targeted, and the environments where they're being applied. And second, where environments might be somewhat constrained, like in really busy urban green spaces, or on green roofs that have little extent to them, interventions can be designed to integrate these principles of restorative environments with individual level engagement practices to lead to stronger wellbeing outcomes for our urban populations. And I'm going to leave it there. Thanks very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Rose. I'll now welcome our next presenter, Fatma Balany. If you come up, please. Fatma will speak to the effect of green infrastructure on microclimate and human thermal comfort.
Thank you.
Thank you and welcome. There's your clicker there.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Fatma Balany from Victoria University. First of all, I want to acknowledge my supervisors, Dr. Nitin Mutil and Dr. NN, and my sponsor, Australian Award Scholarship, who provide the sponsor here in Australia. I will start with brief introduction. Oh, sorry. Sorry. No.
There we go.
Okay. Oh, okay. Sorry. I will start with the brief introduction of the problems of cities are facing. One of the obvious problems is urban heat island effect. Temperature is increasing, and as a consequence, we see a lot of people fall sick. Mortality rate is increasing, and so on. And actually, several strategies have been recommended and implemented to mitigate this adverse effect of urban heat island. And one of the most promising strategies is green infrastructure, which is our theme for today. However, some problem related to the implementation of green infrastructure, for example, the benefit of green infrastructure is very varies by location and also urban morphology, so it should be investigated locally. Another problem is usually when we want to investigate the performance of different mitigation strategies, we use modeling. And however, in this modeling, the vegetation element is the most complex element to be modeled, and very few model can accommodate simple vegetation, not complex vegetation. And also recently, it was found an water element in green infrastructure can reduce this temperature. However, it hasn't been explored much, and so the benefit hasn't well yet understood, not to mention here in Melbourne. So based on this, my research aims to try to investigate the different types of green infrastructure and how they affect to microclimate and human thermal comfort. And also I have added some water element in my scenarios to see the effect on microclimate and human thermal comfort. And what I have done to achieve my aim, I started with digitizing CBD. This is a Melbourne CBD case. So I started digitizing CBD on rectangular grids, including building and vegetation. And then calibration and validation was conducted to ensure that my model can represent the actual condition of Melbourne CBD. And the process was carried out by comparing some microclimate parameter between simulation result and on-site measurement. And the statistical analysis was used to evaluate the model performance, and it was found that the model is reliable enough to represent Melbourne CBD condition. And then the validated model was used to simulate the different scenarios, green infrastructure and blue-green infrastructure or water element, using data during summer 2021. Here we can see scenarios I have simulated. And what's the result? We can see on the slide that microclimate parameters, there are actually some other microclimate parameters, but I just put temperature and relative humidity. And we can see that the significant reduction of temperature happened on 3 scenarios. What about green walls and green roof? Green walls and green roof only experience very small reduction, even if we have covered the building with all of the green walls on green roof. And the fountain, there is also noticeable reduction of temperature, but it's very locally, only occur at a distance less than 30 meters from the fountain. And what about the HTC? In my research, I use PET, or psychological equivalent temperature, to describe the human thermal condition in CBD. There are several ranges of thermal perceptions, starting from very cold to very hot. And then from the simulation result, we can see that only 3 scenarios can improve thermal comfort condition in CBD, from hot to warm. For example, from case 3 100%, there are 4 points observation reduced, improve out of 25 point observation. And in 3 to 100% scenario, there are 18 points of 80 point of observation reduced out of 25 point of observation. So based on this, I draw a conclusion that green walls and green roof in high-rise building environment, like one in CBD, have a very small improvement in microclimate, as well as human thermal comfort. Trees in general have quite significant cooling effect, and then it can improve human thermal comfort condition in CBD. And then water element can still decrease temperature, especially fountain, but it cannot improve human thermal condition in CBD. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fatma. And that just is an incredible demonstration of how important the range of different greening techniques are that we are pursuing here, but they each play their role. Next, Julia Schiller. Can I welcome you up to the... Oh, sorry, I got it wrong. Sorry. Zara Sain, bringing native Australian annual flowers to your roof. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Zahra. I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Melbourne, based in Burnley campus, and I work with Professor Nick Williams and Dr. Claire Farrell. And my PhD is on native Australian flowering annual species with potential to be used in landscape design and green roof in particular. The central aim of my thesis was to better understand the suitability of using annual plants on extensive green roofs in seasonally hot or dry climates, as annuals offer some advantages on the roofs, including cheaper and faster establishment through sowing seeds, adding visual attraction due to colorful flowers, which would also provide nectar and pollen for pollinators and provide quick coverage and blooming, yet the usage of these annual species have been explored less in research. Annual species are important plant life form globally, and particularly in Australia, which is a continent with high level of plant diversity and has a rich flora of annual species, many of which distributed over dry and semi-dry parts of the country, which are environments that can be analogous to green roofs. Direct seeding is an effective way of establishing annual plants on green roofs. Therefore, my project was started by sourcing commercially available seeds, which unfortunately for most of the species are rarely available in big quantities and cheap prices. And the creation of a diverse plant community by directing sowing of complex seed mixes require a reliable supply of those species. One of the main constraints in seed-based projects relate to the seed germination capacity and the level of seed dormancy. And a germination test and reported germination percentage allows for the accurate calculation of sowing rates and a more realistic assessment of the performance of the seed lot after sowing. So the first step in my project was performing a germination test, and in case of dormant seeds, finding pre-treatments to break the dormancy to increase their germination rate and speed. 16 species of my initial 58 supplied species with higher than 50% germination percentage we used to create the seed mixture. And then we conducted an experiment using green roof modules sown with our seed mixes with a sowing rate of 4 grams per meter square. We applied 3 different irrigation frequencies, 2 days, 4 days, and 6 days between irrigation. And we evaluated how irrigation frequencies would affect plant cover, species abundance and richness, and their diversity, and the traits of the plants. The result of the experiment showed that native annuals seemed to be good candidates for applying on green roofs, as our modules sown with the mixture achieved higher than 80% plant cover, high abundance and diversity, regardless of the irrigation frequency applied. Plants only were shorter with the smaller leaves in the lowest irrigation, but they were still as abundant and species rich as the highest irrigation. However, high irrigation frequencies are likely to be needed during hot summer months in climates where rainfall is sporadic or limited. Some of the annual species we used in this experiment failed to establish, but most of them established well and showed good growth and flowered for almost 6 months after sowing, and probably produce seeds to ensure persistence on the roofs. Finally, although annual species can provide high coverage and diversity on the roof during their first growing season, mixing them with perennial plant species such as succulents would provide sustained vegetation cover and flowering when annuals are dead. We also need to answer questions about the best time to distribute the seeds on roofs, trying different sowing rates to get the optimum rate for different climate conditions, different irrigation availabilities, and different species included in the seed mix. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Zara. I'll double check this now. Okay, Bihan, go. Please come up. Bihan will be speaking to plant survival on green roofs. Yep. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, I'm Bihan, a late-stage PhD candidate at School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences of University of Melbourne. I'm studying the relationship between succulents and plant water relation under drought, and how succulents relate with the plant survival on hot and dry green roofs. First, I'd like to acknowledge my supervisors, Claire Farrell, Rebecca Mailer, and Stephen Arendt, and the fundings I received from Hot Innovation, City of Melbourne, and Melbourne University. The word succulents originated from succulents, like the stem succulents in bottle tree, the leaf succulents in aloe vera, and the root succulents in cactus. But succulents as a trait describes the plant water storage in either leaf, stem, or root. And this means that non-succulent plants can also have succulents. But it is a seldom researched trait, and it is unclear that whether the succulents can relate with the survival on hot and dry green roofs. In order to maximize green roof biodiversity and expand the plant selection beyond true succulents, we selected a mix of evergreen shrubs, subshrubs, and herbs for our green roof module experiment. Despite its classification as temperate climate, Melbourne's summer can be very hot and dry. For example, it was reported a mean maximum air temperature of 35 Celsius degree and total rainfall of 80.6 millimeter during a challenging summer for green roof plants. We therefore selected 11 species based primarily on their use as green roof plants in Mediterranean-type climates. We then narrowed down our selection to include a broad range of life forms and a range of leaf succulents. We conducted experiments to determine the morphological traits, including succulents, and determine the survival in 10, 15, 20, and 25 centimeter scoria substrates. We found that plants in deeper substrates did have greater survival, and woody plants have better survival than herbaceous plants. but plants with greater succulence did not necessarily have greater survival in all substrate depths we tested. One possible reason is not all stored water is available to plants for functioning. The water drop on the left-hand side represents the total plant water storage, which is succulence, but only part of them can be used. The other part is bound water, which is an essential component of the plant structures. So we selected plants and did another dry-down experiment, monitored the water change during the whole process in plants. We're trying to answer how plants use their stored water in different organs. And thanks very much.
Thank you, Behat. Now, take two. We'll bring Julia Schiller up to the stage. And Julia will be speaking to green roofs as biodiversity stepping stones in cities.
So I'm also a PhD student at the University of Melbourne, and I'm part of the green infrastructure research team based at Balany campus. And I'm very happy that through my PhD I'm guided by my supervisors, Dr. Amy Haas, Dr. Kyle Trefall, and Professor Nicholas Williams. And my PhD is about how we can use green roofs as biodiversity stepping stones. And what that actually means, I'm going to tell you in a bit. So I aim to find out what is the habitat value and the connectivity value of all those green roofs we have already in the city of Melbourne. And for that, I did a study where I went to actual existing green roofs and I surveyed them for native pollinators and how they interact with the local floral abundance and which landscape parameters is affecting their presence. I also installed a bunch of native endangered Dinella amina species on bare roofs to see how bees actually move up to the roofs. However, I decided to concentrate on two different projects within my PhD to present to you today, since I think they are most interesting for the audience. So first of all, I did a survey of how many green roofs do we have in Melbourne. How did I do that? I used high-resolution near-map images to pretty much scroll through 17 local government areas. And those government areas were defined by being within a radius of 20 kilometers to our urban center, the CBD. When I found a green roof, I used a GIS information system such as QGIS to draw a polygon and measure its area. But I was also interested in how much of that green roof area is actually vegetated. So altogether, I created a database that contains 224 green roofs, which is located across 13 local government areas and contains characteristics, information about the characteristics, location, roof area, green area, height level, the year of construction, the building type, the accessibility, and the function. I've decided to present you not the entire database, but some results from within the city of Melbourne. This is the uptake over years. We had an uptake of 1,050% within the last 2 decades. So this graph goes from 2000 to the end of 2019. With that, I actually have to correct the acting Lord Mayor. We now cover in the city of Melbourne 8.8 hectares with green roofs. That's yeah, right. And that was a total growth of more than 1,000% within 2 decades and an average annual growth of 14%. So we're on a good trajectory. Just for you as a side information, City of Melbourne contains 51.3% of all the green roofs I found within 17 local government area. What does it look in detail? Here I plotted some of the results for the green roofs within the City of Melbourne for you, and that summarizes that the typical green roof within the City of Melbourne is located on a mid-story level, which means somewhere between the 3rd and 5th floor level, so on top of it. It is part of a multi-story apartment building and is used for passive recreation by its residents. For more information, just come to me talking later, or wait for my publication on that. The second part is, as I told you, the connectivity value of it. I'm interested in where do we need to locate those green roofs. And just to give you a theoretical background, imagine you have Park A and Park B, Park A, Park B, and in between you have an urban environment. We now want to look at what is the probability of an animal movement. In the case of my PhD study, native bees. The probability of moving from Park A to Park B is minor to not existing. If there is no green roof, then adding a green roof on a medium or low level building increases the chance of a bee moving through the urban landscape. But what happens if we add green roofs on most buildings of different heights? The urban city, the built environment might not act as a barrier of movement for native pollinators, but rather facilitate movement. And that's something I'm really looking forward to, and that's something I'm actually trying to model. With open source data from the city of Melbourne, I created this so-called resistance surface. It works with the same colors, red symbolizing barriers of movement, green showing the parks which have no constraint of movement for native bees. And I want to see how three different bee species move across our city, move from green space to green space. And I use 3 different bee species that are common within our city, and they are all generalists when it comes to food resources, and they're ground nesting solitary bees. The only thing that differs is their body size. This is a very small, a medium, and a large-sized bee, blue-banded bee. Most of you probably recognize this one. And with their body size, they have very, very mobility rates. So we go from 31-meter home range to 1-kilometer home range, and I will put them into this model, and I will see how they will move from this park to this green pocket, for example. So to access the current ecological connectivity of the city of Melbourne. And as a final step, I will add green roofs, existing but also future green roofs, and see what is the importance of those green roofs for their movement. Will it actually increase it? And then with that, we can figure out where there are some shortages of connectivity and target those spaces for additional green roofs. And in the end, I just hope that with the information about how to design a green roof and where to locate it, we can actually increase the mobility rate of our pollinators. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And final speaker today is Dean Shrieker, who's speaking spontaneous green roof vegetation. Welcome, Dean.
Thanks, Fiona. My name's Dean. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne and under the supervision of Dr. Claire Farrell and Professor Nick Williams. And today I'll give you sort of a brief overview of some of the research that I do as part of my PhD, and also hopefully provide a bit of a compelling argument for why having some weeds on the green roof might not actually be such a bad thing. So without routine maintenance, the vegetation that we plant on green roofs changes over time and is often completely replaced by weedy, spontaneous vegetation. And this is typically considered to be a failure of the green roof, and so we put a lot of time and energy into managing and removing these species. However, spontaneous vegetation is inherently well adapted to the green roof environment, and so understanding its traits and the ecology of its communities can help us better design green roofs, but will also give us an idea of the influence that these species have on green roof functionality and those beneficial outcomes. Oops. So on your left, you can see a very shallow substrate green roof that is planted with a monoculture of succulent sedum species. This type of roof is very common globally, but not in Melbourne. So as Julia mentioned, the roofs that we have in Melbourne are typically for recreation, so they usually have deeper substrates. They're engineered to be accessible to people. And we plant them similarly to how we plant some ground level landscapes. The problem with the roofs that we have in Melbourne is that they are very expensive to engineer and construct and to retrofit, and also they're quite expensive to maintain. The sedum roof, however, is much cheaper and yet still provides many of the benefits that will eventually become necessary to comply with the City of Melbourne's future planning policy requirements. But is the sedum roof an optimally functional green roof? And is it an optimally sustainable green roof? The green roof on the right there, which is in the City of Melbourne, was left unmanaged for approximately 3 years prior to these images being taken. As you can see, there's a high level of spontaneous species cover and spontaneous species diversity. And this provides flowering continuity and pollinator resources and habitat for a range of species. Also, it's very low maintenance. Could this roof be as functional as this sedum roof? For example, we know that plants can help a green roof's capacity to mitigate stormwater through their transpiration. So we looked at the water use and drought response of 9 common spontaneous green roof species, and we found a trade-off between water use and drought response. So faster growing species use more water, whereas slower growing species were more drought tolerant. When we compared the results of this study to previous work that was conducted by my supervisor, Claire Farrell, we found that some of the faster growing spontaneous species transpired at a rate that was 10 times greater than some sedum species. So we can quite comfortably say that some spontaneous species are probably better at stormwater mitigation than some sedum species. We also found a diverse range of water use and drought response strategies. And diversity in these strategies has been associated with beneficial outcomes on green roofs. So how do we maximise the functional diversity of spontaneous species on green roofs to take advantage of those benefits? We conducted another experiment where we looked at the effect of sedum cover and water availability on the traits and growth of a community of 14 common spontaneous green roof species. I sowed them into modules that were filled with green roof substrate that had varying amounts of sedum cover from bare substrate to 100% cover, and were provided with a well-watered or water deficit irrigation regime. We found that increasing sedum cover reduced the species and functional diversity of the spontaneous communities, so there were less species within the community, and the species that remained in those communities were more functionally similar to each other. Water availability, on the other hand, influenced the biomass, so the well-watered modules had a greater biomass in the spontaneous species, and these species invested more of their resources into traits that helped them utilise that water. So to maximise the species and functional diversity of the spontaneous community, we want to minimise sedum cover or just not have sedum there at all. To limit spontaneous species, if we're not interested in the weeds, we would maximise sedum cover and minimise irrigation, so reduce that species and functional diversity and reduce that biomass. The issue is that in reducing that species and functional diversity, you're actually probably diminishing the functionality of the green roof itself. And while social norms around weediness may limit the desirability of some spontaneous species, in a rapidly urbanising world, the functional benefits of these species may eventually outweigh other considerations. Thank you.
Yes, hi, my name is Watkin. I'm interested in was it Zaha? I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. On the native annual planting. Couple of questions. Did you run that experiment over multiple seasons, or do you have any idea how that planting would respond over multiple seasons? Did you see, say, evidence of self-sowing?
Like it works, yeah. No, actually, I think in the slides I mentioned the date that we started. It was from March to September or something. Unfortunately, because it was exactly during the COVID time, I couldn't even attend to the university to, do my measurements. It was a very, we had very restricted access. Separate from my experiment, I had another experiment which I grow the plants and I collected the seeds, but it was for another student to do the germination. The species that I had, I bought the seeds, and unfortunately we didn't have any information about the storage conditions and stuff. And as you said, we just, as I mentioned as well, we just grow them for one growing season. But there was another honor student who continued my experiment for the next season, and she evaluated how many of those species have grown up again from the seeds, which the results are not out yet. But based on our evaluation, we need to reseed for a couple of species because the wind would, take the seeds away, and they don't just exactly sit in the same, place to grow. There are a couple of limitations that need to be investigated, but and as I mentioned, annual plants grow not for a year, complete year. They have like 6, 7, 8 months growing, and we need to mix them with other types of plants to have a whole year coverage for the roof. I hope that I answered your question.
Thanks everyone for a great presentation. My name's Ben. Sorry, I've forgotten your names, apologise. I just have a question about the non-maintenance research project. From the photos, I'm pretty sure that was the Pixel building. Has that green roof subsequently been maintained, or is it still doing its thing? Have you had any opportunities to discuss with designers the idea of designing for succession? Do you think your research might be able to lead to that? So rather than keeping an initial design fixed and maintained for years, thinking about, well, if we do this now, in 5 years, 10 years, it's going to look different, but that's in a way planned, even if it's not fully maintained. Thank you.
I can't answer the first question with 100% certainty, but I think it has been maintained. I know there was a plan to convert it to a more productive planting, but I'm not 100% sure. In terms of succession, actually one of the final chapter of my PhD is a global traits analysis, and I will be looking at how the communities change over time, how the community's signature of spontaneous vegetation is influenced by the original planting. So that'll give us like some idea about how it changes. I haven't talked to any designers about that sort of thing, but I'd love to have that dialogue, because I think that the research that I'm doing really can inform that. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks everyone, enjoyed that. I've got a question for Julia on your bee study. I assume that what you did was purely modelled in terms of the connectivity between, for the bees to get from one side of the city to the other. Did you take into consideration the desire of the bees to fly up 4, 6, 8, 10 stories, and is that actually realistic, do you think?
So we cannot talk about the desire of a bee to go anywhere because we don't understand how they think. But they're definitely driven by certain things. So they need to look for food, they need to look for shelter, they need to look for mating partners, right? And so one part of my PhD was, let's say, in areas that don't have a lot of favorite floral resources available at the moment. And I put those onto bare roofs of different heights on Parkville campus That was a COVID adjustment. It used to be within the city in areas that don't have a lot of green. But on campus, it worked the same way. We installed Dinella amina plants, which can only be pollinated by native bees. So we put them out there on different heights and on ground level, and we wanted to see which bee, so what type of bee, and how often do they actually have the desire to go up there on certain heights. And that definitely goes as, and I also did a survey of 20 green roofs, where I surveyed exactly what was the flower interacting with what kind of bee, or the other way around. And this is part of my connectivity model in the end. So right now, this is again COVID related, I will use that data to evaluate the model. So I will first model it, and then I will look through my samples, which currently are still pinned, and I try to identify the bees to species level, and we'll see how successful my model was actually in predicting to find a bee of X meter of mobility compared to another one that has much higher mobility rate. How good was my model to actually predict it? And then I will do adjustments accordingly. So it does give me an idea of how likely it is to find a bee in certain areas on the green roof, but not necessarily the desire of the bee to go up there.
Hi, they were really good presentations. Broad Street's my name. Question to Ben, I really enjoyed your spontaneous approach, and I've always been interested in the 3 Fs, flora, fauna and fungi. And in looking at spontaneity, any thoughts, Dean, on how you could start out to design the roof so that fungal spores actually help you may be inoculating, but any thoughts on the spontaneous occurrence of fungi in your research?
Not specifically. Yeah, I can't really provide a good answer to that. I imagine that you would inoculate the substrate with spores, perhaps. To create the conditions necessary for fungi to grow, you usually need to have high moisture and a humid environment. So I don't really think that many green roofs would fit those criteria, but perhaps on rooftops that are shaded by other buildings, you could do something like that. It's an interesting question. There's not really that much research on fungus generally, but especially on green roofs. So yeah, maybe someone else can take that up in the future. But yeah, it's an interesting question.
I think that is all we have time for today, but we do have some refreshments at the back of the room. Welcome everybody to hang around and catch up and have a chat for the next half hour or so. It's been wonderful to see you all, and can I especially thank the Acting Lord Mayor for your attendance and your welcome earlier, to our project partners at DELP, who are all here in the room, and especially to Rose, Zara, Bihan. Trying not to look at my notes. Fatma, Julia and Dean. Just another round of applause. Thank you so much.